The three universal characteristics act as a basis for dukkha in the Four Noble Truths. As described earlier, the dukkha of the three characteristics refers to the conflict and stress inherent in conditioned phenomena, preventing them from any lasting stability. All conditioned things, all things that occur, that ordinary people know and experience, are subject to this characteristic. Another way of phrasing this is that this pressure and stress is a natural characteristic of the five aggregates, khandha. Every human being and everything that ordinary people come into contact with is a conditioned phenomenon and is comprised of the five aggregates. If people lack understanding and deal with things unskillfully, a sense of oppression and affliction arises within themselves, which we call suffering. This suffering experienced by people is the dukkha of the Four Noble Truths. Although it is real for these people, it is not a universal characteristic of all things. Isolating this dukkha of the three characteristics is convenient in one sense, but it should not be completely removed from the other two characteristics. That is, one should recognize that all conditioned things are subject to three universal characteristics. Impermanence, anicca, having arisen, things dissolve and disappear. Pressure, dukkha, all conditions or factors that constitute or associate with something are under pressure and unable to sustain an original shape. And non-self, anatta, things exist according to causes and conditions. Things do not possess a self or distinct, abiding essence that is able to own or control things. In short, all conditioned things are unstable, unreliable, and unenduring. The arising of suffering, dukkha, in the Four Noble Truths is not simply due to the pressure, dukkha, outlined in the three characteristics. Indeed, all three characteristics, anicca, dukkha, and anatta, act as a basis for suffering in those individuals who lack a true understanding of them. All conditioned things, or the five aggregates, including the entirety of what makes up human beings, the body and the mind, are impermanent, subject to pressure and non-self. It is in their nature to be marked by these three characteristics without any interference by human beings. For this reason, the three characteristics are distinct from the Four Noble Truths, even though both of these teachings share the factor of dukkha. So, at what stage do the five aggregates become part of the dukkha described in the Four Noble Truths? The answer is when they become the five aggregates of clinging, upadana khandha. The five aggregates of clinging, upadana khandha, are precisely these same five aggregates, but here they are grasped onto or cherished by clinging, upadana. Technically speaking, they are accompanied by mental taints, asava, and act as a basis for clinging, upadana. One can define this term, upadana khandha, as the five aggregates born of clinging, the five aggregates as the point of obsession for clinging, or the five aggregates as the focus of attention for clinging. They pertain directly to ignorance, avidya, craving, tanha, and clinging, upadana. This is what is being referred to in the First Noble Truth. In the following teaching, the Buddha distinguishes between the five aggregates and the five aggregates of clinging. Monks, I will teach you the five aggregates and the five aggregates subject to clinging. Listen attentively. And what are the five aggregates? Whatever kind of form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, consciousness there is, whether past, future, or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, these are called the five aggregates. And what are the five aggregates of clinging? Whatever kind of form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, consciousness there is, whether past, future, or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, that is accompanied by mental taints, sasawa. That is a foundation for clinging, upadaniya. These are called the five aggregates of clinging. When the Buddha taught the three characteristics, he would invariably state that the five aggregates are impermanent, subject to pressure, and non-self. The true nature of form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness is marked by these three characteristics. He did not state that the five aggregates of clinging are impermanent, subject to pressure, and non-self, because these are already included in the wider classification of the five aggregates. The important point here is that by grasping to the five aggregates, they develop into the five aggregates of clinging, and this grasping leads to suffering. The following is a teaching on the five aggregates in relation to the three characteristics. Monks, form is impermanent, feeling is impermanent, perception is impermanent, volitional formations are impermanent, consciousness is impermanent. Monks, form is dukkha, it is under pressure by its conditioning factors. It is unsustainable. Feeling, perception, volitional formations, consciousness is dukkha. Monks, form is not self, feeling, perception, volitional formations, consciousness is not self. Seeing this, the instructed noble disciple lets go of form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, consciousness. Letting go, he extricates himself. Through dispassion, his mind is liberated. When it is liberated, there come the knowledge. It is liberated. He understands. Destroyed is birth. The holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There is no more for this state of being. When one clearly understands conditioned things according to the three characteristics, the five aggregates of clinging do not arise, or they cease to exist. Instead, one experiences freedom, luminosity, joy, and an end of suffering. In the sutta on turning the wheel of Dhamma, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which was given to the group of 5 disciples, Panchavaggiya, the Buddha gives a lengthy description of dukkha, the first noble truth, this noble truth may be defined as. Now this, monks, is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering. Union with what is displeasing is suffering. Separation from what is pleasing is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the five aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. The ending phrase, in brief, the five aggregates are subject to clinging or suffering. Sankitena panchupadana kanda dukkha is the gist of this passage. That is, all the previous statements are summed up by this ending phrase. The Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta was the first sutta taught by the Buddha. No one had heard this teaching before this occasion. A group of 5 disciples would not have been familiar with how the term dukkha is defined in Buddhism. We can compare this with how the Buddha taught the First Noble Truth on later occasions. At one time in Savatthi, indicating that this event occurred a long time after the first sermon, the Buddha explained the Four Noble Truths to the bhikkhus, who would have had a foundation of understanding. Here, in relation to the First Noble Truth, the Buddha focuses exclusively on the 5 aggregates of clinging. Monks, I will teach you suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the way leading to the cessation of suffering. Listen carefully. And what, monks, is suffering? It should be said, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging. What 5? The form aggregate subject to clinging, the feeling aggregate subject to clinging, the perception aggregate subject to clinging, the volitional formations aggregate subject to clinging, the consciousness aggregate subject to clinging. This is called suffering. And what, monks, is the origin of suffering? It is this craving that leads to renewed existence, accompanied by delight and lust. Seeking delight here and there, that is, cravings for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, craving for extermination. This is called the origin of suffering. And what, monks, is the cessation of suffering? It is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving, the giving up and relinquishing of it, freedom from it, non-reliance on it. This is called the cessation of suffering. And what, monks, is the way leading to the cessation of suffering? It is this Noble Eightfold Path, that is, right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. This is called the way leading to the cessation of suffering. From this passage we can conclude that the many examples the Buddha used to describe suffering in the first sermon refer to conditions or situations related to suffering that general people are familiar with. After establishing a basic understanding of the subject matter, the Buddha went on to describe the gist of suffering, the 5 aggregates of clinging. He had not provided common examples of suffering first. The listeners who lacked a foundation of understanding would have been at a loss. In other circumstances, or in other Dhamma teachings, the Buddha may very well have presented other familiar examples of suffering to his listeners. whichever examples the Buddha may have used. However, he would have eventually summed up human suffering as the 5 aggregates of clinging. Note this teaching by the Buddha connected to the 4 Noble Truths. Monks, in reference to the statement declared by me, this is the Noble Truth of suffering. There are innumerable nuances, innumerable meanings, innumerable interpretations. In reference to the statement declared by me, this is the Noble Truth of the path leading to the end of suffering. There are innumerable nuances, innumerable meanings, innumerable interpretations. Therefore, monks, you should strive in order to understand according to the truth. This is suffering, this is the path leading to the end of suffering. This passage confirms that all of the Buddha's teachings, the entirety of Buddha Dhamma, can be summed up by or included in the teaching of the 4 Noble Truths. Although some teachings do not specifically refer to the 4 Noble Truths, they are still encapsulated by this key teaching. The following quotation from the Kula Dukkha Kanda Sutta, which describes the suffering and harmful effects of craving for sensual pleasures, kama tanha, along with describing a wholesome stage of practice on the noble way, ariyamagga, towards the final stage of cessation, nirodha, is a case in point. See here Mahanama. Before my awakening, while I was still only an unawakened bodhisatta, I too clearly saw, as it actually is with proper wisdom, how sensual pleasures provide little gratification, much suffering and much despair, and how great is the danger in them. But as long as I still did not attain to the rapture and pleasure that are apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states, to something more peaceful than that, I could not declare to be one who would not return in pursuit of sensual pleasures. Yet when I clearly saw, as it actually is with proper wisdom, how sensual pleasures provide little gratification, much suffering and much despair, and how great is the danger in them, and I attained to the rapture and pleasure that are apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states, or to something more peaceful than that, I could declare to be one who would not return in pursuit of sensual pleasures. And what Mahanama is the gratification advantage in the case of sensual pleasures? There are these 5 chords of sensual pleasure. What are the 5? Forms cognizable by the eye, that are wished for, desired, agreeable, pleasant, that are inviting and provocative of lust. Sounds cognizable by the ear, odors cognizable by the nose, flavors cognizable by the tongue, tangibles cognizable by the body, that are wished for, desired, agreeable and pleasant, that are inviting and provocative of lust. These are the 5 chords of sensual pleasure. Now, the pleasure and joy that arises dependent on these 5 chords of sensual pleasure is the gratification in the case of sensual pleasures. And what Mahanama is the danger, disadvantage in the case of sensual pleasure. Here, on account of the craft by which a clansman makes a living, whether counting or accounting, or calculating, or farming, or trading, or husbandry, or archery, or the royal service, or whatever craft it may be, he has to face cold, he has to face heat, He is plagued by contact with horseflies, mosquitoes, wind, sun, and creeping things. He risks death by hunger and thirst. Now this is a danger in the case of sensual pleasures, a mass of suffering visible here and now. Having sensual pleasures as its cause, sensual pleasures as its source, sensual pleasures as its requirement, the cause being simply sensual pleasures. If no wealth comes to the clansman while he works and strives and makes an effort, thus he sorrows, grieves, and laments. He weeps, beating his breast, and becomes distraught, crying, "My work is in vain, my effort is fruitless." Now this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasure, the cause being simply sensual pleasures. If wealth comes to the clansman while he works and strives and makes an effort, thus he experiences pain and anguish in protecting it. How shall neither kings confiscate it, nor thieves plunder it, nor fire burn it, nor water sweep it away, nor hateful hares make off and squander it? And as he guards and protects his wealth, kings confiscate it, or thieves plunder it, or fire burns it, or floods sweep it away, or hateful heirs make off and squander it. And he sorrows, grieves, and laments. He weeps, beating his breast, and becomes distraught, crying, "What I had I have no longer. My previous possessions are no longer mine." Now this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasure, the cause being simply sensual pleasures. Again, with sensual pleasures as the cause, sensual pleasures as the source, sensual pleasures as the requirement, the cause being simply sensual pleasures, kings quarrel with kings, nobles with nobles, Brahmins with Brahmins, householders with householders, mother quarrels with child, child with mother, father with child, child with father, brother quarrels with brother, sister with sister, brother with sister, friend with friend. And here in their quarrels, disputes and arguments, they attack each other with fists, clods of earth, sticks or knives, whereby they incur death or deadly suffering. Now this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasure, the cause being simply sensual pleasures. Again, with sensual pleasures as the cause, men take up swords and shields and buckle on bows and quivers, and they march off to war, both sides engaging in pitched battles, with arrows flying, spears hurled, and swords flashing. Some of these soldiers are pierced by arrows, some are lanced by spears, some have their heads cut off by swords, whereby they incur death or deadly suffering. Now this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasure, the cause being simply sensual pleasures. Again, with sensual pleasures as the cause, men take up swords and shields and buckle on bows and quivers, and they charge bastions coated in hot mud, with arrows flying, spears hurled, and swords flashing. Some of these soldiers are pierced by arrows, some are lanced by spears, some are splashed with boiling manure, some are hacked by harrows, and some have their heads cut off by swords, whereby they incur death or deadly suffering. Now this too is a danger in the case of sensual pleasure, the cause being simply sensual pleasures.